Welcome to Stories That Matter. I'm your host, Doug Thompson, with my special guest, Raymond McDonald. And Raymond has written the book, Merle Haggard Was a Friend of Mine. And Raymond, I'm going to tell you, I read through the book. I didn't get to read the whole thing, but I scanned through it. And it is really, really well written. Did you have some help writing it, or are you just that good of a writer?
Yeah, I had a lot of help. I just decided I would write a book for Merle as a tribute to him. And my son is a writer, Benjamin, and my friend Rebecca Sheeran from Bakersfield, who I met in 1965. She's retired like me, and she had plenty of time to help me edit the book. And she actually formatted the cover, the back cover, the interior, all the 106 pictures, and researched it tremendously. She was a tremendous help. And my sister, Connie McDonald, she is a retired school teacher, so she helped edit it as far as grammar goes.
Well, as we get to the end of the program, we'll put up, of course, a picture of the book and how the folks can get the book. And those people that helped you and the work that you did was fantastic. But you got quite a story for a Kansas kid. You were born in Parsons?
Yes, I was born in Parsons in 1950.
All right, okay. And then from there, of course, I think you said you were about 9 years old and you made your way to Hollywood.
So, yeah, my dad used to work for the Topeka, Kansas newspaper. He was a linotype operator, and he got a job in Hollywood in 1959. So we got on a train, went all the way to Hollywood, and then we wound up in Bakersfield after that, and that's where I met Merle Haggard.
You guys were just like the Beverly Hillbillies then, except you didn't have the transportation. You got on the train, and boom, you went out to, we're in Hollywood.
Yeah, my dad never had a car. He never had a car. Strange, but that's in those days. I guess that wasn't unusual. I don't know.
No, that's it. Probably wasn't. But you guys made it to Hollywood, and then you go over to Bakersfield.
Yeah, and that's where we ran into Merle Haggard. His mother lived across the street from us in Oildale, actually. And one day, my mother and Merle's mother, her name was Flossie. She was from Arkansas. My mother and her were friends. They called them over the fence neighbors in those days. And one day we were watching TV, a local TV show, country music live TV show every day in Bakersfield. It's called Cousin Herb's Trading Post. And my mother, Virginia Saylor, Mary Virginia Saylor, that's her nickname. That was not her nickname, that was her maiden name. She was a huge country music fan. She always had country music on the radio in Topeka, Delano, Bakersfield, wherever we were, she had it on all the time. So this was a live TV show, though, every day. And on comes this guy singing one day, and we're going, "Woo, this guy's good." We'd never seen him before. Well, about 15 minutes after the show, a car pulled up. It was springtime, I'm going to say, 1964. And a guy got out and walked up to the house across the street. And I saw him and I said, "Mom, the guy that was just singing on TV just walked into the house across the street." She goes, "No, he didn't." She peered over my shoulder and she goes, "Well, yeah." And I know his mother. It was Merle Haggard. He was like 27 years old. And we're going, wow, this guy lives across the street.
And you just heard him on live television and he could sing.
Woo. Oh, never heard anybody sing like that.
What was your next contact with him?
Well, Mike and Buddy Owens were the sons of Buck and Bonnie Owens. And Buck and Bonnie divorced in like 1952. So this is 64. So what, 12 years later? Mm-hmm. But Mike and Buddy Owens were my friends from school. And we became very good friends. And I would go to their house all the time and visit with Bonnie all the time. She was a singer also on that show, the Trading Post show. And I knew who she was, of course, because she was a star locally and she had national records too, like Stop the World, Let Me Off, things like that. Well, her and Merle had an album out at that time called Just Between the Two of Us. And so Merle would come over there and visit. Well, that's the first time I actually talked to him. He came walking up the sidewalk one day, and I was in the front room plucking on a guitar, not very good as usual. And he walked in the door and he saw me sitting in that couch, and he knew I was the guy that lived across the street. And he looks at me and he goes, "Why don't you tune that guitar?" And I said, "I don't know why I tune that guitar." And that's the first time I actually spoke with him. And we were good friends from that time on.
And so you went to school with the Owens brothers. And
Yes.
Over a period of time, did you get to know Merle more?
Oh, yeah, because he was over there a lot. And of course, I'd see him across the street every once in a while, wave to him, you know. Uh, and then in 1965, Merle and Bonnie got married. And I moved to Los Angeles with my mother and father. I didn't like Los Angeles because they were having the Watts riots down there at the time, Doug, 1965, August 65. It's a well-known fact that they had terrible riots down there. And I didn't like Los Angeles. So I called Mike and Buddy Owens. And I said, "Can I move back to Bakersfield and live with you and Bonnie and Merle, Bonnie's mama?" And they said, "Yeah." So I lived my sophomore year at high school, which was North High School in Oildale, with Bonnie Owens, Merle Haggard, Buddy and Mike Owens, and Bonnie's mama.
So you were best friends with Buck Owens' two kids, and
Yes.
and you went to school with them.
Yes.
And then your family relocated to would it have been downtown L.A.?
It was actually Southgate, which was
South.
very near Watts. When they had those riots, it was curfew time, and it was horrible. And I wanted out of there, man. And plus the smog, and you know, I wasn't used to a big city. I wanted to go back to Oildale where my friends were. I had a lot of good friends. And so Bonnie and Merle obliged, and I got to live with them my whole sophomore year. The guy taught me how to fish. He cooked for me. He took me to restaurants. I'd never been to a restaurant. My dad didn't have money for a restaurant. We had 6 kids. And so, you know, he was just like a second dad to me, just the sweetest man. And this is just a few years after he got out of prison. You know, he was 28 years old when he took me and Mike and Buddy in. And of course, he had his new wife, Bonnie, and Grandma kept an eye on us when they'd go off on tour.
Wow. And they just opened the door for you and said, "Come on, move on in with us."
Yes, they did.
That's awesome. That's awesome of them. And then, so did you stay there for that whole school year?
I did the whole year, and it was so different because I got to watch this man grow almost every day. He worked on his craft all the time. Hey, you go in the front room, Merle Haggard sitting in there playing guitar and singing. Pretty good, huh? I mean, and he was young too, you know, and he was just the nicest guy. And you told me you read some of the book, and of course I try to explain how nice he was. He was just the nicest guy. He was, and Bonnie, of course, too. They were so much in love. They just got married, and he started hitting some big records. You know, "I'm a Lonesome Fugitive." Here we go. "Swinging Doors," "Bottle Let Me Down." We were right there.
That I know, as you look back on it, you think, well, you know, it was just natural. I would come in from being out playing ball, playing catch, doing something else, walk in, he'd be playing the guitar. Just sort of took it for granted that's Merle.
That's Merle. No, he'd rather play a guitar than play baseball.
Wow.
But he was good at baseball too. He told me he was good at baseball.
You just had to take his word for it.
He could do anything, actually. He was very talented, very ambidextrous, and athletic, as a matter of fact.
And then at the end of your sophomore year, did you move out of the home?
Yes, because Merle had 4 children from his previous marriage, and they were actually being looked over by Flossie over there in Oildale for about a year or so while we lived with Merle and Bonnie up there on the other side of town. And so after that 1 year, he decided he'd get his kids back, and he sent Buddy and Mike to live with Buck Owens, who's their dad, at a ranch out there in Bakersfield. And I went back with my mother and father to Los Angeles.
And his 4 kids moved in.
And it took about a year or so because he was building a new house, a mansion, out by the mouth of the Kern River, which he made famous. just like he did Muskogee, right?
That's right. You're exactly right.
Yeah, he did. And once he got that built, they moved out there. But he lived in a country club type home before that and got all his children back with him, which was, of course, normal. And he needed his children. He loved his children, all four from his first marriage.
Okay. And then you were always staying in contact with him and his family?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we were good friends. I, of course, went and had my own family and got married. And I was a disc jockey, actually. I worked for Buck Owens at KUZZ in Bakersfield. And Merle actually would come down there and bring his records sometimes, and we'd play them. Yeah, we were good friends. He was sweet enough to do that.
I read that in there about you being a DJ, and man, you had quite a career with all of that.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun playing records all day long. I loved music from the time I was little, because I think mainly because my mother always had it on. And my older brother, Bobby, was 9 years older than me. He was my roommate in Kansas back in the 50s. And so I got to hear from my mother's radio, George Jones and Johnny Cash and Patsy Cline, et cetera, et cetera. But my brother had on a guy named Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis and all those guys. So I'm going, this is all great, man. I mean, so lucky to have grown up in that era where we had rock and roll and country music. I loved it. Just absolutely loved it. So I loved being a disc jockey. That's what I did all day long. Played records on the radio. It was great.
And I remember you said, and I read in the book that you started, your hours were like midnight till 6 or 5 or 6 in the morning when you first started.
That's right, midnight to 6.
And then you just sort of owned that network, because you were moving around at different times and you were pretty progressive with what you were playing, doing a good job.
It was a lot of fun. We started off playing rock and roll. So I had Jimi Hendrix going, Beatles, Rolling Stones. And I love that stuff because I was a kid.
Yeah.
And then Buck changed the format from rock and roll to country. So when it changed to country, I knew it. I'd heard it. I knew all those songs. Jimmy Dean, Big Bad John. You know what I'm talking about, Doug?
Yeah, I do. Jimmy Dean and Big Bad John.
Come on, man. Jim Reeves, Patsy Cline, Connie Smith, Marty Robbins, Johnny Cash, Buck Owens, Merle Haggard. So I used to play Merle Haggard 3 hours out of 6. Why not?
I'm with you. I'm with you. I understand. I love that country music, and we grew up in an old farm out in Kansas, and so I had an old hay barn. And I would get to listen to all of those guys on the radio when I was shooting baskets or doing whatever. And it was always great. Raymond, one of the things about being close friends with Merle Haggard was you got to meet many of those people that you played their records on the late night and different times as a DJ. You got to meet some of those people, didn't you?
Almost everybody.
How did that feel? I know I read in the book where you met Ringo Starr and had just a short conversation with him, but all of the other people, how did it feel like, man, I'm talking to Ringo Starr. I'm talking to this person or that person.
It was surreal because Ringo, the Beatles were huge in my life. I love the Beatles. In fact, we used to play the Beatles at Merle's house, and he'd come in and go, boys. We'd have him just blasting the walls because he had this great sound system, And the Rolling Stones too, and he'd go, boys. And we'd turn it down a little bit. But anyway, Merle, when I got to meet people like that, and believe me, they were coming to see Merle. That was the reason. They were all Merle Haggard fans, all of them. But Ringo, Paul McCartney, Garth Brooks, George Jones, Johnny Cash, Leanne Womack came on the bus one time, the great singer Leanne Womack.
Right.
She was trembling that she got to meet Merle Haggard. And I was trembling because I got to meet her. And she was gorgeous and this great singer. And even Angelina Jolie from the movies pretty much jumped on Merle when she met him. I got to meet a lot of the singers and some huge Ernest Borgnine, for God's sakes. All these people, they're Merle Haggard fans. Everybody's a Merle Haggard fan, turns out.
Well, I can see why. I can see why. You know, one of the things that I saw in there when I was going through the book, you got to come back together with Merle again, not only just being friends and seeing each other on holidays and things like that because of the family, but you got to go back and you actually worked for him.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was fortunate. In 1998, his office manager died, and he asked me to take his place, and I did for about 9 months, from 98 to 99. And so I was working, I lived on his property at a home he had there, an extra home, and took over his office manager job. So I was day to day. And then in 2001, I started in January, again, as his office manager and personal assistant in his home up in Palisadro, California. I did that for almost an entire year. So I was there every day. His office was in his living room, Doug. So he wanted me to answer the phones, and he would listen to what I was saying. And that way there wasn't, he would nod yeah or shake his head, or if there was somebody that was really important that I'd say, Tony Brown from CBS Records, he'd go, give me that phone. But if it was somebody he really didn't want to talk to, he'd go, like most people, talk to them today.
Get rid of them. Well, then a little further down the road, well, one other thing before I go down to where you became the driver for him, you got to meet a friend of his from his days in the prison, and that guy's name was Frisco. Tell me about that.
Oh, I started the book off, as you know, Doug, with the story about Frisco. Lawrence Mackey Francisco is his name. He was at a concert that Merle was performing in Bakersfield at the Fox Theater. Holds about, 1,500, 2,000 people, like you'd find all over America. But it was in Bakersfield, so we're hometown going. And I went out to the lobby at intermission and was mingling with my friends and all the crowd, everybody getting a beer, you know what I mean?
I've seen it happen.
And this guy and his turns out to be his nephew walked up to me, these two distinguished Black gentlemen. Now, at a Merle Haggard concert, it was unusual to see a Black man or woman at his concert. Not entirely impossible, but unusual. They were probably the only two Black pearls in the whole audience. And they walked up to me because I had my backstage pass on. And the older man said, do you know Merle? And I said, sure. Do you work for Merle? I said, yeah. He goes, I've been waiting 60 years to see him. We were in jail together over here at the Bakersfield jail. And I think it was, it was 60 years before that, early 50s, about 1954, I think it was. And I said, what's your name? He said, my name is Frisco, and Merle will know it. And I want to see him. I've followed his career my whole life. We were in jail together. And he told me this great story, Doug. He said, when we were in jail, this little guy comes in there, this little white guy, and he was scrapping with everybody, and he was holding his own real well. Because in those days, when you went in the jail, you were on one big cell together. And he said, I was really impressed by his fighting abilities and that he was such a scrapper, but he was a little guy. Merle was 5'8". In those days, he might have weighed 120 at the most. But he was strong and he was tough. And he said, tell Merle, ask him if he remembers the story how Frisco came up and said, now, look here, to all the other inmates. Now, Frisco was 6'2", 180 pounds in those days, 21 years old. Merle was 17, 18. And Frisco said, boys, in this jail cell, I am the mayor of the jail cell, and I am appointing Merle the sheriff. Now, if any of you guys messes with Merle, you're going to get a thumping from me, the mayor. And he was a big man, and he was known as, and Merle, I found this out later, Merle said he was the best boxer in Bakersfield. Could have been a professional boxer, but his dad was a preacher, and he didn't want him beating people up for a living. So he'd just box people and knock them all out. They'd bring the best boxers in California through there, and Frisco beat them all up. But he never went into that profession. He became a pastor of his own church. Merle hadn't seen him in 60 years. So he gave me his number, and he said, tell Merle to call me. I want to see him. I haven't seen him, and I love him. I've followed his whole career, my whole family. All I do is talk about Merle Haggard, plays records all the time. So the next day, I was driving the bus to Los Angeles, and Merle's sitting next to me in his jump seat. And I said, Merle, you know a guy named Frisco? And man, he like jumped out of his chair. He said, Frisco? He looked at me, Frisco? What? I said, he was at the show last night. He goes, Frisco was at my show? Oh my goodness. He goes, let me tell you a story. And he told me the story I just told you about how Frisco was going to whip people if they didn't leave him alone. And so I gave him his phone number, and he goes, oh my goodness. He goes, they got on the phone, I think a few days later, and they talked for hours and got to meet up again. And it was really heartwarming. It's, as you know, Doug, it's the introduction in the book. It was really special for Merle.
Oh, I'm sure that it was.
And of course, Frisco and his whole family.
Sure. Those connections would have been so valuable to them, just like the memories that you have from it, Raymond, of the times that you were a part of that family. I don't mean just living there, but I mean always connected with them. Merle treated you like a son, and that's because you felt that way to him. And then if we move on forward to where he said, hey, I need a driver for the bus. Did he come to you?
Yeah, he knew I was driving limousines in Bakersfield in 2009. I'd been driving about 3 years driving limousines. So you have to have a Class B license, commercial license. I got one. He knew I was sober. He knew I wasn't drunk. He knew I wasn't smoking anything. And you have to be that way when you get a commercial license anyway, or you'd be in big trouble. So I passed it, drove these limos for a few years. And middle of the night, one night about 3 a.m, I got a call from Merle and a guy named Timmy Howard, who was his guitar player at the time. And they were in Dallas, and they said, can you fly to Dallas tomorrow and drive the band bus? Our band bus driver quit in the middle of the tour. And I said, yeah. So I called my boss over at Luxury Limousines and Susanna and Troy. And I said, look, I need to go to Dallas tomorrow. Can you take me off the list here for a while? I got to go help Merle. They said, sure. So I flew to Dallas the next day. Norman Hamlet, who is Merle's steel guitar dobro player, and Fuzzy Owen, his manager for 50 years, taught me how to drive that bus. I didn't know how to drive a bus. And they taught me how to drive them. Both of them Fuzzy was over 80 at the time, and Norman was inching up on 80. But they showed me, and I learned how to drive the bus. After a year, Merle said, all right, come over to my bus and let's see what you learned. And he kept me on as the lead driver on his bus for the next 5 years or so.
That must have been quite an experience.
Yeah, it was a hard job. I had no idea how hard it was and the responsibility, but I learned it. And thank God we never had a wreck, never had anything happen like that. And we drove, I figure I drove 700,000 miles in 5 years, but we never had any problems like that. But I got to tell you, the whole thrill about the whole thing to me, Doug, was this. I was fortunate enough to go to nearly every major city in America in that 5-6 year period, and a lot of small ones. And he would walk out on that stage, and I'd watch him from behind the curtain, and the crowd would just go crazy just to see him. They didn't have to introduce him. Norman Hamlet had a song he played, the band would play, and he'd just walk out there. Anybody who's seen Merle Haggard show knows that was the case for decades. Didn't have to introduce Merle Haggard. Here's Merle Haggard. They didn't need that.
Yeah,
he'd just walk out there, which was even more dramatic. And anyway, that was a thrill for me. And then, of course, to watch the reaction of the crowds. He always did a great show. He had a great band. And that was, to me, was the payoff, that I got to watch him. We went to every state 48 states. And we drove every state. I really love going to the little towns because they seem to be a little wilder there, especially in Kansas, Oklahoma, Iowa, Texas. They were like, wow, here's Merle Haggard. It was fun.
Well, I bet it was. I bet it was. And what a time you've had here, Raymond. This is absolutely fantastic. And want to encourage people again, buy that book, because there's one story after another. And you come down to the bottom line, there's one event that took place. Were you around Merle at the time that he passed?
No, and I was called about 2 days before he passed. His son called me, and he said, and his daughter too, from his fifth marriage. And they said, Ray, you need to get up to the ranch here. I was living in Las Vegas at the time, and that's about 700 miles from Las Vegas. They said, Dad's really bad. And I said, well, I'll be there soon. And they go, you need to get here as soon as you can. And I knew he was in trouble. And it really hurt me, of course, to know that he was in trouble and that he was dying. He pretty much told me that about 2 months before he died. He called me from the hospital. He said, I'm dying. And it broke my heart. So I was on my way up there on April 6th. He died on his birthday, for those that don't know that. On his 79th birthday, he died. And I was on my way up there that morning from Bakersfield. I'd stopped in Bakersfield, which is about 450 miles from Palo Cedro, California, where he lived. And his son called me and he said, Ray, Dad took the 9 o'clock train. And I knew what that meant.
Yeah.
But he wanted to go home. He was sick. He had said he wanted to go home and see his dad. His dad had died when he was 9 years old. He wanted to go home and see his dad. That's the way he put it.
I remember reading that in the book, and it was so touching the way that you had written that a week before he died, that he had told those who were there with him that I'm going to die on my birthday. And he did.
Yes, he did.
And he did.
Yes, he did.
And he did. Well, Raymond, you did an awesome job with the book. And we're going to put the contact information up so that those who want to get the book can get it, because, man, there's just one amazing story after another. And there's some people that helped you with that book. Who helped you?
My son, Benjamin, is 40 years old, and he's a writer. And he edited a lot of the stories that I did, made them so much easier to read and so much more interesting. My friend Rebecca Sheeran, also from high school, so she's retired like me, and she took over the whole book. She did the front cover, the back cover. She formatted the interior. There's 106 photos in there. She put those all in there. She formatted the chapters. She edited it. She researched it and did a tremendous job for me. And my sister Connie McDonald is a retired teacher, and she helped us edit it grammatically. So I had 3 people that helped me immensely. And of course, my daughter Allison was telling me for years, go, Dad, go, write the book, get it out there. And a friend of mine, Kip Sullivan from Bakersfield, he financed it, because I'm an unknown author. You don't just go out and get a book done with a publishing house somewhere. You got to, nowadays, you can go ahead and set the book up yourself. And the company that helped me is called Book Baby. And Book Baby is a portion of Amazon, and they're the ones who put the book together for me, and 326 pages and a lot of insight into Merle Haggard, as you know, Doug.
Absolutely, and we'll put the picture of the book up and the contact information, and I'll tell you, for the 5th time during this interview, you did a really, really good job. Family support and all involved. And it's just like, as I read through the book, it's just like I was standing behind you when you were doing some of these things, and you took the job at the DJ at midnight, and Merle called and said, drive the bus. You drove right by where we are right now. We're in the middle of Kansas. You drove right by on I-70. Half a mile off, you'd have been here. And,
yes, sir.
So, and you're a Kansas kid. So there you go.
Yes, I am.
Well, yes, Raymond, thank you so much.
I love Kansas, and I wanted to say I'm from the Potawatomi Nation over there in Mayetta, and all my family that's in Topeka in that area. I love them all. And the Kansas folks has always been real special to me.
You're always welcome back in the state anytime you want. You take care.
Thank you, Doug.
God bless you.
God bless you, sir.